Zoom. Shabbat Shalom. All right. Everybody, here we go. We have a lot to learn today. Let's go. Good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning, good morning. You want to invite everybody who is online. As soon as you get your morning face on, please join us facially. We don't want to, facial recognition is a very controversial technology, so we prefer just to be able to see your faces and see those of you who are with us. Panim Panim, Shabbat is the day of the face. Kabbalat Shabbat, B'nai Shabbat Nikabla. Ein Domeh Panav Shel Adam b'Shabbat. Like your face is different on Shabbat, so we'd love to see your face in Montreal and in other cities around our global community here this morning. So we're going to begin with our morning blessings and then make our way into the Parsha. It's a juicy Parsha. There's a lot of beautiful Torah in it, and every year we get a chance to revisit it and relearn and renew. So let's begin with Baruch Atah Eloheinu Asher Yisham b'mitzvotav v'tzivanu l'asok b'divrei Torah. Okay, I'm going to share my screen. Those in the Zoom, please give me a thumbs up if you see the text in front of you. Awesome. Those of you in the room, you should have the text as well. Chapter 41, let's start. And it was after 2 years and days. Ufaro cholein, and Pharaoh was dreaming. It's a past tense, also plural. It's the present as well. So he's dreamed and dreaming. V'hinei omed ala Ye'or, and behold, he was standing on the Nile. The Ye'or is the Nile. V'hinei mina Ye'or olot sheva parod yafot mar'eh uvri'ot basar v'tir'ena ba'achu. And behold, the word behold appears here quite frequently, like an immediate apprehension, v'hinei, right? And it was, and he saw. From the Ye'or came 7 cows, yafot mar'eh, beautiful to look at, briot, basar, and very healthy, fleshy. They were briot, bari is Hebrew, it means to be healthy, but basar, they had the way that my grandmother used to, whatever, when she'd see if I added a few pounds, she'd like it, she'd grab it, briot, basar. Vatir ena ba'achu. And they were grazing in the reed grass by the Nile. And behold, v'nei, sheva parot acherot olot achreihen, and 7 other cows ascended after them, right? Arose after them from the Nile. Ra'ot mar'eh. Wow, they're really evil to look at, bad to look at. They don't look good. V'dakot basar, and exactly the opposite. They're thinly fleshed, right? They're emaciated. V'ta'amod na'et v'abrot asar, and they stood next to the ones. Right, they stood next to the other parrots on the lip of the Nile, by the Nile, right? Verse 4, and the bad-looking cows, they ate the ones who were ugly to look at and emaciated and thin in flesh, ate the 7 parrot yafot mar'eh v'abriot, and ate the healthy fat cows. Vayikatz Paro, and Pharaoh startled awake. Vayikatz, it split him, woke up. Vayishan vaychalom shenit, and he went to sleep, and he dreamed a second time. Hinei sheva shibalim, and now there are 7 sheaves. They're coming up 7 ears rather, that are of grain that are on one stalk. 7 ears of grain on one stalk. They're olot bekaneh echad, in one kaneh, in one stalk. Briot v'tovot, the same word used for the cows, bari, is now being used for the ears of grain. Briot v'tovot. Verse 6, v'hinei, sheva shibalim dakot u'shedufot kadim tzomchot achreihen, and there were 7 ears, dakot, thin, and also scorched, dufot kadim, like scorched by the east winds, tzomchot achrehen, that bloomed after them. Now verse 7, Vativlana Shibalim Adakoret Sheva Shibalim Abriot Vamleot. The 7 ears, Tivlana, we'll come back to this, they swallowed up, right? Vativlana, they swallowed the the thin ones, swallowed the healthy ones that are also now the word used is malay, full. And again, the same ending as we saw earlier in verse 4, Va'ikatz Paro, and Pharaoh was startled awake, and behold, wow, v'hinei chalom, which is almost maybe what he was thinking. Wow, it was just a dream, right? Right. It's almost like the verse is also in his mind. V'hinei chalom, ah, behold, it was just a dream, right? He thought it was real. Vahiva boker, and it was in the morning. Vatipaim rucho, and his tipaim means like his heartbeat again, his spirit returned, or some such thing. But here, vatipaim means maybe it was still bothering him. It was still in his mind. Vatipaim here is almost like a bell. It was ringing. It wouldn't stop ringing. He was really agitated, maybe. Vayishlach vayikra et kol chatumei Mitzrayim. He called out and he sent for all of the magicians of Egypt and all of the chachameh, all of their wise ones, which will come back later. The word chacham, wise. He's looking for wise men. Vayisaper Paro lehem et chalamo, and Pharaoh recounted to them his dream, v'chalamo. Now there, it's interesting. Nechama Leibowitz points out very beautifully here. She's such a close reader of text in Hebrew. He told them his dreams, but in the Hebrew, what does it say, Alan? Is it his dreams or his dream? Chalamo, his dream, not chalamotav, his dreams in the plural, right? In the Hebrew, is already telling us something about how his own understanding, right? This relates to how he knew that Joseph was going to give him the right interpretation. There's something already in his own self-understanding of what was going on in these two distinct dreams that's reflected in the singular, his dream. And of course, you see the way that they understood them in the very next 4 words, V'ein poter otam leFaro. And there was none who can interpret them to Pharaoh. One of the clear indicators of their misunderstanding, misapprehension of what the dreams portend is this distinction grammatically between his own understanding they were one dream, and they're trying to make them 2 distinct dreams, which of course is a clue as to why and how Joseph enters this narrative in any way, right? So already in this moment, okay, so we're going to get to Joseph in a second, but first the great moment of in stories of radical audacity, which, of course, the story of Joseph is a story of radical audacity, if it's anything. Multiple levels of audacity. His own audacity, telling his father that one day, the brothers, and also his father would come and bow before him. That's pretty audacious, right? The audacity of Joseph's, being in the house of Potiphar, and what she does to him, which is pretty audacious. There's lots of people acting audaciously, and here there's a moment of audacity, which is easy to skim over. But look what happens at that moment when Pharaoh is agitated. The Sar HaMashkim in verse 9, the wine steward, the sommelier of Pharaoh, he speaks up. What? He's there in the court, and he's like, Pharaoh's agitated. He thinks, I don't know if anybody knows the story already, you know that this wine steward is not exactly Pharaoh's favorite person. I mean, he brought him back into the court, but he originally got really pissed off at him and sent him into the jail. And it's like, he should probably be like at this moment thinking, okay, I'm just gonna just keep serving the wine, And so he turns now in verse 9, Vayidaver Sar HaMashkim et Bar Lemor, like this wine steward is like, excuse me, Pharaoh, like what? He says, Et chata'ai ani mazkir hayom. I love this phrase. I say it all the time. Whenever I make a mistake, I say, Et chata'ai ani mazkir hayom. My sin I will now proclaim. I remember my sin. Or let me start with my sin. Like I made a boo-boo. Like I made a huge mistake. I'm to blame. Remember, Paro katzaf alavadav, you Pharaoh were angered at your servants, meaning me and the baker, former baker. And and you sent me into the clink. You sent me into the prison, and also the Sara Ofim, right? You sent each of us to the prefect, and we were there. Verse 11. We each had a dream, and me and him, and each one had a dream according to their own separately. Each one had their own interpretation, which is also interesting because Pharaoh also has two dreams, and now Joseph will be shown to know how to differentiate between two different dreams. But Pharaoh was also looking for somebody who knows how to bring two dreams together, right? Clearly. But anyway, he says, and there was with us Na'ar Ivri, a lad, a Hebrew lad, Eved, the Sar Dalchim, who had been a servant to the prefect, right? And that's a penalty every single Shabbat. I have to figure out how to make that into the stamp like that. This single view. Oh, so we told him our chalamot. By the way, if anybody wants like a word that is the most important word in the parsha here is certainly the word patar. Like patar, pitron, liftor means to interpret here. It's also, by the way, it's homonym with patur, which means innocent.
Wow.
Right? The tav here, of course, it's not the same word, but it is absolutely, in rabbinic literature, becomes a word of, right, to release something. Liftor is to release its meaning, to let it out. Patar with a tet is a different meaning, but it's a homonym. So anyway, so here, each one has their own interpretation. And behold, he was really good at it. As he had interpreted, it actually took place. Oti hishiv al kaniv ototala. In other words, he said exactly what was about to happen in the future. Now, by the way, you notice here that this telling Pharaoh that Joseph is good at it involves being good at it means that it has something to do with the future. Like the accuracy of interpretation is not in the way that we would imagine it, like with Jung, and does it correspond with your own internal experience, and like, this is your father, and this is your mother, in the cave, right? Here, there's something about the ability to take the symbol of the dream and connect it to the portents of what's about to take place. That acts as a kind of, he'll get the job, or he might be an interesting, he's someone I'm looking for. Clearly, Pharaoh already knows that it's one dream, and he also knows that it's about the future. Something here is being told to him, and he gets it. And so both of those intimations, just by looking closely at the text, at what serves Pharaoh, actually answer a very big problem for the Mefarshim, like for the commentators here, which is, as you'll see in a moment, Joseph will give an interpretation, and immediately Pharaoh will be like, "Oh, that makes sense to me," and we'll be like, "What? Why? Like, what was he saying that they weren't saying?" Okay, so we'll get to that in a second. So Vayishlach Paro, verse 14. Vayikra et Yosef, and he calls Joseph. Right? So verse 14, he calls out to Joseph, and Vayiritzu. This is a great moment, right? A star is born, right? A star is born potentially.
Goes to the Jerusalem.
Right, he goes to they bring him up from the pit, which is just like, think about this phrase. And they rush him up. Vayiritzu, they rush him out of the pit. And they prepare him, like they say, you're coming to meet, the President of the United States. You're coming to meet the most powerful man in the world, most powerful ruler in the world. Vayavo el Paro, and he comes to Pharaoh. Right? And I don't know about you, but I'm imagining him, he's all clean shaven now, he's been in the pit. By the way, it's like I'm making this into a joke, but the story's now coming out of Israel and about what it was like to be for 57 days as children. I was listening on NPR yesterday. One of the children, one doctor said she'd never seen anything like it in 50, like the hygiene, the level of hygiene that they brought out, the lice and they weren't cared for on any level. Many of them. I mean, there were some that were. Like there was another story in the Times last night about a mother and her 3 children. But anyway, so here they bring him out.
He was there 2 years, right?
He was there for 2 years, and they shave him and they put clothing on him and they bring him to Pharaoh. Vayomer Paro el Yosef. Now, so I put a break there so you could see now. Now this moment between Pharaoh and Joseph. And I'm wondering, like, I'm curious for all of you, but the last time Joseph spoke to a powerful person, it didn't. He's not really having good. He's not having success speaking to very powerful people.
Last time he spoke to anybody.
Right. Well, he spoke his dreams, right? But anyway, so now he's about to speak to Pharaoh. Vayomer Pharaoh el Yosef, verse 15, and Pharaoh said to Joseph, Chalom chalamti. Again, in the singular, right? Not chalamot chalamti. I had many dreams. It says chalom echad. Chalom in Hebrew is one. Again, it also can be plural, but it's just interesting in the way that he's framing it. Chalom chalamti the ein poter oto. He doesn't say otam. There is no one who will interpret it, not them. It's one. V'ani shamati alecha. It's a great phrase. Ani shamati alecha lemor. I heard it said of you. Right? I heard it said of you. Tishma chalom liftorto. I've heard that you hear a dream and you interpret it. Okay. What should Joseph say at this moment? Well, you should say. What do you think? What do you guys think he would say? Like, what if you?
People say.
Yeah, that's what people say. It's like like I don't know. What would you guys? What do you guys think? Like, you should probably say. I dabble. Right? Oh, your Pharaoh. That Oh,
I think it's brilliant what he says.
Right. So let's see what he says. So let's see what he says. So Paul loves what he says. So we'll see if others do too. I also love it, and I think it's also, as you'll see, it is actually whoever's writing the story. This is not unintentional. The way that he says this. The question is why he says it this way. It'll repeat itself too. What's behind this response, and whether or not you believe it. Right? Is Joseph actually saying something now towards nefarious or strategic ends, or is this really who Joseph is? Let's see what he says. Vayam Yosef et Paro lemor. And Joseph responded to Pharaoh saying, Bil adai, not me, Elohim ya'aneh et shlom Paro. It will be God, Elohim, the word, of course, for God, Elohim, ya'aneh will answer, right, Pharaoh's welfare. Now, Paul, you love it. Go ahead, Paul.
Well, Joseph has finally learned some manners. He has also learned, or beginning to learn, how to speak to power. And he's also learned how to, at least initially, deflect the responsibility of what he is going to say next to a higher power, which allows him some room of consequence should Pharaoh not like what he has to say.
I think it's more than that. I think this is the turning point in his life. It is the turning point in the entire arc of Yosef's story. We meet him as a 17-year-old who's arrogant and
right.
And now.
So you think that he's learned to stem his arrogance?
In these 2 years, he's not only learned to stem his arrogance, but he has a vision for his own future and his people's future, and it's in the hands of Elohim.
So which one is it? Because it sounds like there are a number. So or all of them? Like it could be all of them are true, but on the one hand, is this a chided, someone who's cut his teeth, someone who's skinned his knees, someone who learned that experientially that he's been humbled by this experience? Has he also, and in some sense, does he actually have a spiritual awakening in prison? All of a sudden now he's wearing a big yarmulke, and like he's coming out wearing tefillin, and he wants to join Chabad, and like he's like, like he's seen the light, he's Baruch Hasheming everybody knows people like this, like, yeah, me, Baruch Hashem, everything, Hashem, this, everything, Allah, Hashem, Krishna, it's like, there are no atheists in these foxholes, or these pits, and he really gets that he's a vessel, he became a Buddha, he's just transparent, it just comes through me, it's not me. Or is it like, not or maybe or also, wow, I certainly am great at this, but if I say I am, I'm going to get thrown into more and more pits. Yes. I better just make sure I give it to God. Like these basketball, like the soccer player, like Lionel Messi and all these, like everybody, there's no more religious individuals than those who are making billions and billions of dollars, putting balls into hoops and other things and other places, and who then say, oh, I just want to give the glory to God, and then I scored 100 points and it was amazing, I'm so great. but God gets all the glory. Like, what is this moment for Joseph? Like, is this who he really is? I wonder, because this has been a debate for centuries, right? What is motivating Joseph now to invoke God's name in a way that he hasn't before, and that he won't again until the brothers come down? You'll see. But okay, so we have a couple of different opinions. All right, I love it, and I don't know if you would want to say that it's both. I wasn't sure if you were saying both. I heard you saying that it's a turning point in his life. I heard you saying a little bit of both.
I think
You never
it's,
see.
I mean, one of the great things
Yes.
about these stories is that
He's clever.
no one is completely transformed at any moment in
Mhm.
time. It's always a process,
Mm-hmm.
and that makes it timeless. Like Joseph is always in the process
Mm-hmm.
of learning how to
Totally.
manage himself.
So this is just a peekaboo into his potential, his ongoing transformation as a human being, which is of course never ending. But this is an authentic moment of his own humility. He's not, cynically using God the way that, let's say, Erdogan uses his own, Islamic, he's secular Muslim, and he often will invoke, religion as a way of appealing to the masses and so on. That's not Joseph here per se. You're saying he's kind of on a continuum. It's authentic, but it's also part of a staggered, back and forth around this. Okay, so Asher Chaim, and then we're going to go forward because I actually want to keep going in this transformative process, and I feel like just like Joseph's not finished, I'm not either with unpacking his transformation. Go ahead, Asher Chaim.
Just to pour a little sand into the fine machinery, it does say that God was with Joseph when he was serving Potiphar, but I notice here, God never speaks to Joseph, and Joseph doesn't say, okay, let me pray to God and get an answer. Rather, he told Pharaoh, God will give you an answer, talk to me, and he immediately speaks as if he sees himself in God's place.
Right. Wonderful. Shamati. I think that is, like, again, depending on how we read that, there's even a way that you're reading it, which can be read differently. In other words, one can read that as, okay, even more so, if God never spoke to you, if God spoke to you and you didn't then say God is the one in charge, then you'd be a little bit crazy. But how much more so if God never spoke to you and yet you've come to that on your own, understanding that he doesn't say Yud Hey Vav Hey, it's the word Elohim, which is a little bit less clear according to most of our traditional understandings of the Torah. Here Elohim is speaking to Yosef in divine inspiration, which is not exactly prophecy, but in any event, the sand is well received. I think that Joseph is an ambiguous character at best. He himself becomes hidden from Joseph. He takes a new name, so his character also becomes obscured in the text itself, and he himself will toggle back and forth between the many different identities and, I'm sure, beliefs and thoughts, as we do too. So that's why he's so human. Let's look at verse 17. Vayidaber Paro el Yosef. And now Paro says to Joseph, B'chalomi hineni omed al svat ha'yor. I'm standing on the lip of the Nile, and he repeats the story. Let's just move through, even though there's slight differences, but the general gist is, let's go to verse 24. And so there's a swallowing of the ears, and I've told it to all of my magician priests, but none has been able to explain it to me. Right? Ein magidli. There's no one who could tell it to me. Now let's look at Joseph's response after hearing the dreams. Source 2, excuse me. Vayomer Yosef, right? Do you see it? Source 2, Vayomer Yosef on the top of page, I guess page 3. There are no page numbers, but on top of page 3, side 3. Vayomer Yosef el Paro. You see it? It's source 2. It's right on the top of the page. Genesis 41. It's also on the screen. Joseph says to Pharaoh, Chalom Paro, what? Echadhu. It's one dream. And so already, like now you know that Joseph, that's the first thing he opens with. Why does he open with that? We already saw that Pharaoh also believes it's one dream. That was the thing that was vexing him. He kind of had a sense, many of the commentators say this, that Pharaoh already had a sense that the repetition of the dream was not to tell him two distinct things, but really to tell him one thing, but he couldn't figure out what he was trying to tell him. And then Joseph adds this, and now in the remaining verses of Joseph's response, we'll see that each of these responses are corresponding open with a line that has God's name in it. Beno Jacob was the first one to notice this, the great theoretician and commentator Beno Jacob. So verse 25 is actually distinct from verses 26 and 27, right? The actual interpretation. Verse 25 serves as a kind of opening. It's like, hey, it's just one dream, and God is telling you what God is about to do. And then he goes on to give the interpretation. The 7 cows that are healthy and the 7 are 7 years, and so are the 7 ears of corn, also 7 years. It's just one dream. And the 7 cows that are emaciated, and the 7 emaciated and thin ears are also 7 years, but they're 7 years of famine, right? And this is the thing, right, that God, and then verse 28 actually pauses and said, this is the thing that I'm telling Pharaoh, what God is going to do is being shown to you, right? He keeps stopping to remind Pharaoh that God is the one who's in charge. Now, if you're Pharaoh, who do you think is in charge?
Pharaoh.
In the Bible. I don't know what Pharaoh actually thought, but in the biblical critique or polemic against pharaonic mindset, Pharaoh thinks that he's in charge. So in some profound sense, Joseph is also like subtly critiquing Pharaoh while at the same time, right, interpreting this in a way that Pharaoh clearly, he can get. Now he says, now by the way, Pharaoh believes in gods. It's not as though there wasn't, right, but there's something here because Pharaoh opened by saying, I heard that you know how to interpret dreams. And Joseph says, no, I'm not the interpreter, God's the interpreter. And then he says that God is also the one in charge of agriculture. Right? You're standing on the lip of the Nile, which also was a god for them. And he's saying, no, let me tell you what the one who rules the Nile is about to do. The one who rules nature. And so there's like the biblical author, again, Joseph, but whoever Joseph is, he's being used in the story to tell a lesson, which is what the Bible's always trying to do.
So he's sort of shifting the power structure, right? He's telling the Pharaoh, I'm the voice of God, so you have to listen to me.
Well, we'll see that in a second.
Yeah.
Yes. Oh, you mean in terms of the interpretation?
Well,
yeah. Well, he doesn't have to listen
in
to
creating this dynamic, he's telling Pharaoh,
Totally.
there's somebody who's more powerful than you, and it's me because God will speak through me.
Maybe. We'll see that in a second. But certainly he's definitely, if Pharaoh buys into this, he will be forewarned that he better utilize Joseph's power for his own good. That's for sure.
Brilliant.
So verse 29, and now the 7 years that are coming are going to be great, right? And then there'll be 7 years of famine, and all of the abundance will be forgotten in the land of Egypt. And then, right, the famine will destroy the land. Verse 31, it like you won't even remember how good it was because the famine will be so totalizing. It'll be impossible to remember when years were plenty. And then, right, again, 2 verses and 3 verses, then he's going to repeat. Now, why is the dream being repeated twice? If now, to underscore the point, the doubling of the dream and now the doubling of God's name in verse 32 underscores that it's one dream and its repetition should not confuse you because it's really, God is trying to say, I'm really trying to get through to you. I tried with the cows and you didn't get it. You're not going to get it with the cows. I'm going to try with these ears of corn. I'm trying to wake you up and say, here it's coming. And so the repetition now, the doubling of God's name now, yet again, right, serves this purpose, right? Now here's where it gets tricky. So far, so good?
Yes.
Verse 33. This comes right back to the question of what motivates Joseph. V'ata yirei paro ish navon v'chacham v'yishiteo al eretz Mitzrayim. Verse 33 says, now, right, let Pharaoh find someone, right, who is an ish navon v'chacham, a smart right? The word chacham here comes back. Remember the chachamim are the ones whom we call to interpret? Let him find an understanding and wise person and place that person over the land of Egypt. V'yaseh paro v'yafked pikidim al haaretz v'chimesh et eretz Mitzrayim b'sheva shnei asova. And then he gives this advice, right? He actually gives advice, and they'll gather all of the wheat, right? Verse 35,
Wait a minute,
right?
is that Pharaoh saying that?
I'm sorry, there was a, no. There's a repetition somehow, there's a glitch here, 33 is twice, but this is, Joseph says to Pharaoh, right? Now, I interpreted the dream, but now let me give you, like, advice on what to do, knowing this.
So that's Joseph saying.
Right, Joseph says this, which of course, he then tells him, place somebody over the land and let them, set up all of this system to gather the wheat during the 7 years of plenty. We know the answer, right? And then, and all that food will become useful in the years of the famine, and the land will not be destroyed during the famine because of this really smart move on our part. Now, before we get there, I just want to underscore how often Joseph uses the name of God, even though, as Asher Chaim said, he did not ever speak to God, and God doesn't speak to him. But just to underscore this development of his theme, in chapter 39, look at source 3, when he's in Potiphar's house, right? And Potiphar advances on him, right? And she comes on to him, and she makes her moves on him. He avers and he says, "Oh no, I can't. Why? Right? There's no one greater in the house than me and my Lord. Right? The only I can't do this thing. I can't commit adultery. I can't betray my boss. V'chatati l'Elohim, and sin before God. So just to underscore, he's already begun the transformation earlier, and he hadn't mentioned it earlier, but certainly here's a moment where God is invoked. And then, just to say this, to underscore more deeply this transformation of his character, in source 4, right, he had already begun the interpretive process, and his style is not just with Pharaoh, right? Those who say that it was only because he was trying to be, strategic. He already did this in the case of the wine steward and the baker when they had come to him in the previous scenes and said, "Can you interpret our dream?" Yosef said there, "Hello, Elohim biturnim sapru nali." God has interpretations, just so tell it to me, right? So again, you can still say, well, he's placing himself as God, and he doesn't say, well, God has interpretations, go talk to the rabbi, or go talk to God and ask God to give you the interpretation. But in some sense, he is profoundly, I think, trying his best to on some level to invoke God. Now, let's go back to this plan that he brings. So the rabbis are absolutely shocked beyond shocked that Joseph not only interpreted the dream, but in the very next breath, without even waiting for Pharaoh to say something, decided to insert his own sage advice.
Right.
And that seems to be a bit self-serving. Does it?
Yeah.
Wow.
It is beyond interpretation.
He goes beyond the interpretation. So that, first of all, the fact that he even had the chutzpah to do it troubled many commentators. And so it led some of them, for example, the Ramban, Nachmanides, if you look at source 7 is Nachmanides, who's living, of course, in the 14th century in Spain, end of the 13th century, the 14th century. The Ramban is immensely troubled, by the chutzpah of Joseph. In fact, finds it implausible that Joseph would be that audacious. Now, by the way, I said it's an audacious, the entire 13 chapters of the book of Genesis that deal with Joseph are all about audacity of different kinds. So it's not so audacious for Joseph. I mean, it wasn't like he came from rags to riches in his youth. He was quite accomplished. His father Jacob was a big head honcho. It wasn't like he wasn't used to being in front of very powerful men. But the Ramban doesn't like it. Ramban says, this is Nachmanides says, that when Joseph tells them, right, what to do with the grains, it's essentially a continued interpretation of the dream. He says, and the argument is like this, and you're thinking, oh, how does that work? And you don't even have to look at the source. I can just say to you outside. When Pharaoh dreams that the cows, the thin cows swallow the fat cows should make an imprint on the thin cows. Right? If the so there's essentially a disagreement about whether or not the fat years can make a dent in the skinny, quote unquote, famine years, and what one is to do. And so the Ramban argued that here was not advice from Joseph, but interpretation. He was saying to Pharaoh, the purpose of those fat cows is to feed. Your responsibility is to feed, right, those who will be coming who are themselves skinny the way those skinny cows are. Like, that will be your responsibility. That is my interpretation of the meaning of your dream. Of course, and Rashi, who lived before the Ramban, completely disagreed and thought that the meaning of the swallowing of the fat of this moment is that if you look at source number 8, if you want to see Rashi inside. V'nishkach kol hasava, like that Rashi essentially says that the swallowing up means, like, it simply means that you will forget that you had plenty. It's not a directive to, like, make sure that the plenty, like, that you do away, right, with, like, it wasn't a directive. The Ramban, if you look at the earlier source, you want to see it inside, just make sure we understand. In my opinion, this is a sign that the years of famine shall consume the years of plenty. It is from this that Joseph inferred that he should tell Pharaoh, let them store that up, as he saw that the healthy cows and ears of corn were absorbed by the lean ones. This was no mere counsel that Joseph was proposing, for how could he be appointed to be a counselor to the king? It was only in connection with the interpretation of the dream that he said this. These words of Joseph constitute the interpretation of, it could not be known that they'd eaten them up. For Joseph saw that by their consumption of the fat cows, the lean ones did not become fine and plump. They served them for subsistence only. For they had not eaten them, they would have died in their lean state. Right? In other words, they ate the fat cows in order not to die, but they still remained skinny. And so for the Ramban, who's troubled because he doesn't think Joseph can ever stand in front of this powerful person, that is the beginning of the Ramban's problem. He's like, I can't make sense of the scene. Joseph can't go tell Pharaoh right away, here's my plan. That would be it would be absurd. So it must be that what he's saying is, I'm trying to interpret a moment in your dream that you might have missed, which is, you might have wondered, like, what the significance of the swallowing of the cows were, and the fact that they don't become, fat themselves. So the interpretation is that the fat cows become the consumption for the skinny ones to survive, right, to survive. In that sense, make sure that the 7 years of plenty are what the 7 years of famine live off of in a subsistence, right? But for Rashi, who says that the simple meaning of the swallowing of the 7 heavy cows is not that they survived, but that we'll forget the 7 years of plenty. Therefore, there's a danger, meaning that's why for Rashi, Joseph actually had to step forward and explain, right, and give advice, because he had to say, if you want to know how not to forget those 7 years of plenty, make sure that you don't forget them by actually, by taking all the grains and all the plenty that were there and storing them up. And in that way, they will not be forgotten. In other words, he gives them a way out of the dream. In other words, in Rashi's moment, Joseph steps in and says, I know how to make sure that the dream doesn't become a reality, right? The dream doesn't become a reality means that there's a way that Joseph, in Rashi's understanding, Joseph actually is he not only interprets the dream, but he also can change the portent of the dream. For the Ramban, the dream already has within it the way out, right? The way out is, right, that you will, right, that you'll live off of the fact, right? Of course, how does that's like, in other words, for the Ramban, the dream gives you its own solution to the problem, and for Rashi, it doesn't. For Rashi, Joseph has to step forward to say, now you better listen to this, because this is the only way that you will make sure that it's not forgotten. Right? For the Ramban, it's already in the dream. Now, if either both of them to some extent are struggling, the Ramban is really struggling with what, like, probably how could Joseph dare, to speak to Pharaoh? If you want to know how Joseph could dare to speak to Pharaoh, look at Ibn Ezra. I'm sorry, the Abravanel in source 8, which is a much better interpretive moment. Source 9, rather. Oh, by the way, I'm sorry, one second. Before we go to the Abravanel, I have no idea what time it is. What time is it?
9:30.
Oh, okay, great, wow. Before we go to the Abravanel, I just want to say one thing. The Ramban, the beauty of the Ramban's interpretation is that the dream has its own solution. The problem with the Ramban's interpretation is there are things that Joseph says to Pharaoh that are not even remotely in the dream. Like, it's a huge stretch to say that the interpretation of subsisting off of the fat cows is what Joseph is, the extent to which Joseph then lays out. Joseph lays out a lot more. He says, like, let there be a system, and they gather it in. I mean, Joseph added a ton.
And ahead of the system.
And then he put himself in the head of the system. Like, how does the Ramban deal with the fact that Joseph not only told him that this is the way out, but that you have to put someone on top of it, right? He didn't say himself. Joseph didn't put himself.
True.
Now look at this. If you're in the camp that think that Joseph had self-interest involved, look at the Ramban in the 14th century. The very last line of source 8 that I underlined. Source 8.
9.
No, source 8. 9. Source 9. No, source 9. Source 9. Just follow. It's after 8. There you go. Va'amar Yosef kol zeh ba'avur sheyivcharu oto ki hacham einav birosho. The Ramban actually explains, because he knows that his interpretation is a little bit far out, even though I like it, parts of it. How does he explain Joseph's kind of now let someone be in charge? Joseph did it because he wasn't an idiot. Mama didn't raise a fool. He had a sense that this was his ticket. And so the Ramban already puts Joseph's self-interest at the center of that one move. And nobody likes what the Ramban said. After the Ramban said this, he was, in century after century, people said, really? Really? You think that Joseph, who had just said that God was in charge and God was the one who was giving words in my mouth and God this, God that he was thinking about himself? I think the Ramban might say, yeah. And Alina also might say, yeah. But let's look at, but as to the question, how could he have the chutzpah, right, to say something like this in front of Pharaoh? I just want to bring in the Abravanel, and then I'm going to open it up. But just look at the Abravanel in source 10. Abravanel, people say different things. Abravanel. But Abravanel, right, Spanish commentator, later than the Ramban, he writes like this: this advice, Kula amarota Yosef mikoch ruach hakodesh. You want to know how Joseph could say this? You're right. What a crazy, audacious thing to do. What a ridiculous thing to do. But he was gripped by the same power that was helping him interpret correctly what was about to take place. And by the way, just don't forget, Joseph got it right. It has not yet taken place. I mean, unless you think that Joseph is manipulating the world or something like somehow Joseph interpreted dreams correctly. Like we could talk about Joseph's, self-interest, and he's a spoiled little brat. But in the Torah itself, internal to the story, Joseph has a tremendous talent. And whether it's divinely inspired or he took a course on Jungian dream analysis, he's got the thing. He's got the power. So here the Abravanel says, you want to know, Joseph was still in a trance. And had he been in his right state of mind, he would definitely not have had the chutzpah to stand in front of the most powerful human in the world and say, and now, by the way, since I have the stage, let me just tell you what I'm thinking. No, he's in a state of radical prophetic visioning. And he says, I have a vision. And because the nature of a prophet is that they can't, no matter what they try, they cannot restrain themselves and constrain themselves and suppress the Holy Spirit. He said something that was probably not the smartest thing in the world to say, given the realpolitik of the moment. Mr. Nachmanides, Ramban, right? So what bothered you is how could he have said this? And therefore, it must have been part of the interpretation. He's like, listen, I have one more little interpretation to add. Abravanel says, no, that shouldn't bother you that he said something that, in front of a powerful person. Kemosha Amar Jeremiah said in chapter 20, verse 9, that my prophecy was like a fire burning in my bones. Wow. Right? Lo uchal, I could not suppress it. Like I couldn't sustain it. It was impossible. Ki miteva ruach hakodesh kasher yichul belev adam sheyagidu v'lo yuchal lichavsho. That when you have a prophetic moment, you cannot suppress it. And he quotes the verse here, Tovli. I'm sorry, this is not the verse. Verse 11 is for the next piece that we're definitely not going to get to today. I don't know what I was thinking. Okay, I'm gonna open this up right now. I'll just say what I had wanted to do in the last 15 or so minutes was a close look at yet another moment of what was motivating Joseph. Is he being cruel or is he being corrective? That's chapter 42 this morning, but I have a feeling that people have things to say about what we just did, so let's open that up. Alina,
Thank you.
Go ahead.
What about, this was his shot, the guy was in prison, this was his one chance. I mean, to me, what about that motivation, that he had the vision, and I can trust that, but also this was the only chance he would have, otherwise he goes back to jail.
Well, that, of course, is that's exactly what people are saying, that he, in some sense, there is a tension between Joseph's agentic, human agency, let's say, and are we going to make this happen, or is God going to make this happen? Right? Is this something that God is the artist, or God is the ultimate, strategic interest, and his role here is to be minimally agentic so that God's plan can unfold? Is that one Joseph narrative? Or is he an opportunist that says, or do we have a theology that says that God is your partner and God is actually the one who's helping you strategize and saying, hey, go do what you're going to do.
This is your shot.
This is your shot.
Right.
I'm not gonna take my shot. He's got a shot. He's got his one shot. So I think that is the study of Joseph is a study in Jewish intellectual grappling over millennia with theologies of divine intervention and divine, I guess, just divine history versus human history and the relationship between them, right? And what role humans have in shaping the future, what role do humans have in getting out of the way, right? That itself is all of that is being litigated in 13 chapters in the book of Genesis with Joseph. And of course, God's hand is deeply mysterious in the last 13 chapters of the book of Genesis in a way that in the previous 36 chapters, it wasn't. And certainly that theme, right, God as an interventionist God will reappear in a powerful way in the Exodus narratives that are to come, right? In the 13 chapters of the book of Genesis, 17 that deal with, the 13 chapters that deal with Joseph in Genesis, God's hand is hidden in profound ways. Right, and as Rav Asher Chaim already mentioned, God doesn't speak to Joseph the way that he spoke to, Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, and others, right, including Abimelech and others. So it's a decidedly secular element of the Genesis narrative, even though God is invoked repeatedly. And in the Purim narrative, which is based on it, the Purim story is a very similar structure where God is hidden, as the name Esther means, the one who is hidden. And so the hidden hand of God and the human, like how do human beings interact with that hiddenness is what is being litigated, right? And in a unique way that no other chapters or storylines in the five books of Moses are up to that on any level. So we're going to stop there. It's a good. It could be he has to take a shot. We're going to go to Thomas, Nikki, and then we're going to go into the Zoom. Go ahead, Thomas.
Speaking briefly, that Christians like to imagine there's something called Judeo-Christian values, where they skimmed off the cream of the previous crop and made an improvement. And what I love about this is that it really challenges that narrative, because if this was the Gospel of Mark or something, the dream, Pharaoh's dream, would be the opposite. It would be the famine precedes the feast, the scarcity precedes the abundance. And in terms of individual and collective redemption, the narrative would be, no, you have to suffer for 10 years. You have to be purified by your suffering. You have to be scoured and go through a kind of passion, of which the crucifixion is the ultimate example. And then you just got to hang tight, you got to pray, you got to believe, and then you will get 7 years of abundance, just through virtue of your suffering. And I love that this is just the complete opposite, that Pharaoh has a super non-Catholic dream. Some abundance is coming, but then after that, and the agency is not in mere endurance of suffering. The agency is in strategy, preparation, initiative, even audacity. So it's like a super non-Christian narrative, which is really, at least personally important to me. And especially the idea of redemption and Joseph's own redemption. I'm interested in what the reflection is there, and that he's redeemed not by his suffering, and he does suffer, but perhaps through his audacity. His very original sin is also the thing that redeems him.
I could not agree more, and I so desperately wanted to get to the next part of this, because in so many ways these two things inform themselves. Like this, the question of whether or not Joseph intends to make his brothers suffer versus whether or not he's trying to, in some way, to bring them to a realization of their own complicity and kind of help them mature is something that's been debated amongst Jewish commentators and others for millennia now. And various people, I'm sure, will weigh in on whether they like Joseph or not, and they love him. He's really conniving, and he's and he's really scheming, and he's torturing them. He's a sadomasochist. And I think that you can't understand Joseph's character without understanding this theological structure, or this, let's say, ontological structure of the book, which is that the belief that there are both years of famine, there is suffering in the world, and there's also pleasure and joy, and that there is a way for human beings to work with suffering by using their ingenuity, by using their minds, by using their divinely inspired information and wisdom in order to bring about a world of plenty. And that is, it's not a reward for your suffering, but it is the result of your God-given capacity to imagine a different scenario, to change the narrative. And the reason why these dreams become the most important part of the redemptive arc is because dreams, more than any other thing, are open to interpretation and to human beings' ability to decode it. And so God in the Torah is saying life is like a dream that needs to be decoded. And if you have the right interpreter of that code, meaning the right human agentic instrument.
What is agentic, Rabbi?
Like agency, doing things. Like human beings, if they find the right tools, can bring about a world of plenty, and also can bring about moral and ethical blooming and flourishing. That's what Joseph does. Joseph takes on the next scenes are, he will now apply the same strategic brilliance to now bring about the denouement with his brothers so that they learn their lesson and they themselves are redeemed. He not only wants to redeem himself, but he wants to redeem his brothers and his family. Just the same way he wanted to redeem Egypt. Now, I know people are going to say, but at the end, he also did these horrible things to the Egyptians, and that's why we're enslaved. Thank you so much. Let's put that in the side. Not everybody's perfect, and Joseph is not a perfect human being by any stretch. But for the moment, though, I think what you're saying is the deep structure of these stories, and helps to explain why, of all of the ways that this story could have been constructed, it circles around dreaming, Joseph's dreams, right, and then Pharaoh's dreams, right? Wow, like why those vehicles for this story? And I think that ultimately is because dreams are exactly that nexus between, the overly determined and the as not, yet determined, nature. It's almost like Heisenberg showed up in the text of our tradition a couple of thousand years before he presented his principle and said, the one who interacts with the dream and the dream are not two. And okay, how's that for a moment? Okay, we're gonna go into Nikki, and I remember I had an order, Nikki, and thank you, Tomas. Nikki, and then we have our Zoomers.
Yeah.
And then we're skipping Darwin this morning because we're gonna learn for another hour. I'm sorry. Yes, Nikki.
I have a much simpler explanation too, although I really go with Alina. What she said, and that is that a dream is like a poem, and an interpretation is like also from God. A poem, when you write a poem, it's from God. It occurs to the poet that it's from God, and an interpretation also seems that it's from God. And it has that kind of inevitability. It's just a simpler interpretation. So he can feel that this is from God, because anybody who's written a poem knows that it seems like it's from God.
The question has been for us whether or not Joseph was interpreting the dream when he said, put somebody, like, here's my solution. Is the solution part of his interpretation, or is it part of his, like, the interpretive moment is over, and now allow me to advise you, Pharaoh, on how you should react to my interpretation. So that was what was troubling the commentaries for the last couple thousand years, and we saw a number of different camps emerge. One said that it was a continued, in order to avoid that entirely. The Ramban said he's continuing to interpret, like it just never ended, and so in that way Pharaoh could hear it. Another one said no, Pharaoh recognized that this person is speaking from a place of prophetic inspiration and offered advice, but it was advice that had a dire urgency to it, and that really resonated for him. And then there were others who say that he had no choice; he had to take a shot, and if he didn't, he was going to get thrown back into the pit. Although he could have been like elevated into a dream interpreter for the court. But anyway, so into the Zoom we go, and up with Jay and David and go ahead, Jay.
I thought I was being overly cynical, but maybe I'm channeling Ramban. I think that Joseph is being disingenuous in his calling of God, or maybe your nicer way of saying it, strategically brilliant. Now, the source of that brilliance, let's set aside. But he's essentially, this is a job interview, even though the Pharaoh doesn't know that. And it's a job interview audaciously that he is creating, a job that he's creating. Now, who is he dealing with? He's dealing with an all-powerful Pharaoh whose counselors are magicians. This is a guy who believes in magic. So in invoking God's name continuously, Joseph is signaling, hey, I'm a magician, just like all your magicians. You don't have to be afraid of me. You trust your magicians. They're your main counselors. So I'm a magician like all the others magician, and my source of magic is this Elohim guy. And in fact, Pharaoh later says, Ruach Elohim Bo. This is a guy who's got this special magic sauce. And so I think that part of his invoking God is for his audience to have a safe way to deal with him as a man of power.
Yeah, got it. Okay, so to that end, I would just say, to each their own, and 70 interpretations of Torah are valid. I would just add that the proof text that you brought, though, is slightly actually undermines your point and actually supports the other point, which is Pharaoh begins the story by saying, I heard that you know how to interpret dreams. And his last lines, after all of the invocations of the word Elohim, which are not invoked by Pharaoh and not invoked by his magicians, is that Pharaoh says, and by the way, Pharaoh doesn't say it to Joseph, he says it to his own wise counselors and his own magician. He says, how can we find somebody, Asher Ruach Elohim Bo? He actually quotes Joseph's usage. We don't know that Pharaoh ever used that term before. In fact, in terms of, if you look at these words as Joseph trying to tell and teach Pharaoh that someone that is not me, but God who's interpreting. Pharaoh gets the lesson by the end and says, God is in this person. Doesn't say that he's a magician, doesn't say that he, right? So again, your interpretation is also valid, but I'm saying that source text actually is, Beno Jacob himself used that source text to prove, he thought, that word Elohim was Joseph's own pedagogical goal, like to teach Pharaoh about Elohim. So could be that he's a smart guy in and by the way, I don't think it's cynical to say that Joseph is also has been understood as the court Jew who uses his access to power in order to benefit himself and his family. Clearly, if the story of Joseph is a story of how Jews are to survive in lands where people hate their guts, then it's a great story. Like, thank God for Joseph. Had it not been for Joseph, the Jews would not have survived the famine. And thank God they survived the famine. I mean, I'm so happy that they survived the famine. I mean, good for Joseph, and good for all Jewish organizations and representatives in Congress who's lobbying for the Jews. Make sure that Jews receive the only Jewish nation in the world receives Iron Dome so they can defend itself against the thousands of rockets that are landing in Israel every moment and safeguarding my own sister and my own nephew and others whom I love from bad actors. So just put that in as a plug. Yeah. Go ahead, David. David Kurtz.
Rabbi.
You said the five books of Moses. I'm always kind of perplexed by 5 books of Moses. To me, it's at least the 2 books of God. Moses isn't even in. But God speaks in Genesis the truth through dreams. The first time we see him speak in a dream, I think, is King Abimelech. He tells him about the dream, the truth about Sarah, and basically saves his life and that kind of thing. But to really understand, to me, Joseph is either an avatar of God or he has complete faith in dreams, which makes sense as the son of Jacob. Because you go back to Genesis 15:13, know well that your offspring shall be strangers in a land not theirs, and they shall be enslaved and oppressed for 400 years. I mean, this is a beautiful story arc that seems that God is realizing what's going to happen through Joseph, and Joseph he's just this avatar who has no agency himself, has the good fortune of, I don't think it's a good fortune, it's part of the story, it's part of what God's plan, if you want, an somewhat enlightened Pharaoh, which won't happen going forward. But this Pharaoh is open, he's open to all these kinds of things. So it makes a lot of sense to me literarily, which I know is always not as much fun as delving into it. But Bill, I think that's the real way for me to understand Joseph.
Amen.
I love it. I think, again, I come back. I don't know that Joseph has no agency. I think that Joseph is discovering how to use his agency. Right. I think that Joseph, maybe we might call him the drama of the gifted child or some such thing. Or he's obviously a very gifted individual who begins with a bit of a burden, like all of the biblical characters. His name, Yosef, and always we look to names to tell us a bit about the story of who they are. We might call a name a kind of genetic inheritance. His name has 2 meanings that are offered by his mother. One is that God has helped me to gather in my shame, because she had not had a child and she felt ashamed. And so in some sense, like it's, every child in the book of Genesis is used in some way to tell a story that their parents want to tell. And so the story is one of shame being gathered in. And so the name Yosef is connected to the word esof, which means to gather. The Yosef, also his name means, may God give me another son. So Joseph's name means more, or it means having shame gathered in and therefore eliminated, right? And so that's what Joseph brings into the world, and then he's kind of seen by his father as a stand-in for his mother, whom he loved dearly, but she died, and then the first thing we notice about Joseph is that he hunar b'nei Bilha b'nei Zilpa neshei aviv. He's somebody who is being, right, in some way deployed as a go-between between Jacob and and the other wives are the other sons, the other children. So Joseph is already seen as, he's presented, and we know he's presented in this way because he's he is holding the shame of the family. He holds the shame of the family, gathered it in, and he absorbed the stories, and he is an expression of all of those schema in him. He's the dreamer of his father. He's the primed and beautiful one like his mother. He's like the one who will be thrown into exile, like his own father was sent into exile. He's Cain and Abel. He's all of the things. He has gathered up all of the energies of the book of Genesis into himself. He is the carrier, the scapegoat. He has the genetic knots of his family in his own schema. He's thrown into a pit. He is disrobed. His clothing reminds us of the first clothing of Adam and Eve when they first ate from the tree of knowledge of good and evil. And his clothing represents that kind of moment of being naked and vulnerable and being exposed. He's everything. He has everything in him. It's not insignificant that in Jewish history, Joseph will become a messianic lineage. It's not just that King David becomes, but there's another Messiah, the Messiah of Joseph. Joseph represents, he is the one. Not only is Joseph more, but of all of the children, he has 2 children who are then become tribes. And he in some sense is replaced, but he gets double the portion of his brothers, right? But he also gets double the portion because he himself suffered more than all of them. Like we forget that Joseph, like people are critical of Joseph. The brothers did not live for 20 years not knowing whether or not, right, why they were sent into a pit. Like imagine during like the 8th year of that story, where were the brothers? They were hanging out at like a company picnic, hanging out at like the sons of Israel picnic while their brother like, where's Joseph? Oh, so sad that he died, and they don't know and they don't care. They didn't follow the line. They didn't hire a private detective. And imagine like Joseph suffered more than all of the brothers in that sense,
at their hands,
except for Judah, and Judah. Right, Judah, of course, is the hero also, and so I just wanted to come back to Joseph's agency that David was pointing out. Like his agency is troubled because on the one hand, his agency is part of his own demise is how he uses his agency, and part of us, like anti-Semites like to do, point out the reasons why Joseph was picked upon, right, and the reason why the Jews. I had a friend yesterday say to me that sometimes the big there's a notion in psychology which is the greater. Right, in Judaism too, the greater the light, the greater the shadow. The taller you are, the bigger the shadow you cast. So he's starting to talk to me about Jewish shadow. He started talking to me about Harvey Weinstein, and all the and Jews and Mark Zuckerberg and I was like there's no end to the quarter truths, half truths, or even like this much truth that there might be in a stereotype. Like Jews are always looking blaming Joseph. It's Joseph's fault. He told his brothers he was a dreamer and he antagonized them. So that justified them wanting to kill him and throw him into the pit. We don't talk about the brothers' own agency. And the point of the Torah is that there has to be some connection between we have no problem judging Shimon and Levi for what they did in the story of Shechem. But more often than not, I sit in circles where people are like, Joseph had it coming. Look at him antagonizing his brothers and lording it over them. I'm like, really? Do you know what you're saying? Like, okay, so he was a schmuck, or okay, so he didn't know how to handle his own, his own dreaming. He was a teenager. He was 17. He was arrogant. He was, whatever. He was a putz. Let's call him a putz.
He's a punk.
He was a punk, but he's not. He's like, in some sense, what the story of Joseph tells us is that he wasn't a punk. Right. He just didn't know how he just didn't know how to use his talent appropriately. And the punishment, and the story is about that, and it's a story about his brothers coming to understand how absolutely unacceptable and how wrong their actions were. And Joseph becomes both like the one who's taught a lesson about his own power, but also teaches them a lesson about their power. And the lesson also is a bit complicated because on the one hand, he has to teach them that what they did is wrong, and at the same time teach them that even though it was wrong, it was also ultimately in God's plan right. And so how do you do that? How do you tell somebody, you know, what you did was so wrong and I suffered and you should never done it. And he does that to them. He literally walks them through a remedial course on what it's going to be like, right, for now if they come home without Benjamin or they come home without Shimon. And he teaches them. And then at the end of it, when they realize how badly, you know, and they're so ashamed, he has to also be the one who comforts them. Imagine that. He has to comfort them. They feel horrible. And he's like, no, don't cry. It was really all for good. Really? That's amazing.
That's great.
That takes agency.
It's a big
That takes maturity. It's paradoxical. I know people are waiting, so I want to make sure that we get to Amy quickly and then to Beth, and then we're going to call it a morning, and we're going to go learn. We're going to come back to this, a little bit of the story at the end of Torah service today. Amy, go ahead.
Yes, I just want to say that another proof that I thought of that it was God who was guiding the situation was that Joseph did not go to Cairo Agricultural and Mechanical University. He was a shepherd and really didn't have agricultural knowledge. So it would have to have been God who gave him that knowledge. And I also wanted to ask you if you could very briefly tell us why Metates always comes during Hanukkah.
The entire Joseph narrative always comes during Hanukkah because Joseph is that jar of oil. He was a lost son, he was a lost child, and we had to find that lost child. And there are tremendous connections in literarily and thematically between Joseph and his story and Hanukkah. And I mean, if anything, the story of Hanukkah is about assimilation. Joseph is the one who goes down to Egypt and is lost, as it were. It becomes another name, Safnat Paneach, which means the hidden one who is revealed, who speaks. You know, he's secularized. He is the ultimate, you know, expression of God within nature, the same way that the Purim story will be God in nature. And Hanukkah also is a holiday within nature. No supernatural. There's a supernatural miracle with the oil, but that's a later, right? Presumably, it's a very secular holiday. Hanukkah takes place, right? And just like the jar of oil is discovered amidst all the darkness, so is the new moon renewed in the middle of Hanukkah. There's so many things about Hanukkah that relate to beauty, right? It's the Greek aesthetic ideal. Joseph and Rachel are both aesthetes, meaning they're both described, the only ones described in the Torah as being Yefat Mar'eh, beautiful of vision. It's all about the eyes. They didn't recognize him. He recognizes them. He looks, you know, he there's so much. Hanukkah and this Joseph narrative are all there's so much there, but that's for another time. Okay, last one, Beth, go ahead.
Shabbat Shalom.
Shabbat Shalom.
I've been participating off and on for the last 10 years in Jungian dream groups. And we were taught that each element of the dream reflects something about the dreamer. And it's so interesting because where Pharaoh's dream ends is with the fat cow or the skinny cows eating up the fat cows, and then there's no remembrance that there was ever plenty. And the same thing with the sheaves. They get devoured and there's no remembrance that there was ever any plenty. And it's so interesting the way Yosef has inserted himself into this dream as if he's actually interpreting what Pharaoh would have dreamt on the next night, or the night after that, or the night after that. Because Pharaoh didn't have any dream about what came after the forgetting. Joseph inserted himself into that and came up with this solution of how the Egyptians could go about husbanding their resources. And he didn't have to be involved in agriculture to do that. As a shepherd, they would have been doing all kinds of things to manage the herds and paired breedings and all that kind of thing. And knowledge like that is applicable across fields. So it's interesting how he took Pharaoh's dream and then extended it. And that's where the job interview comes in, by placing himself into the end of the dream and expanding on, okay, now what? Debarty.
Yeah, I love that. I just want to end with this, and I want to say this, and coming back to like first of all, the Bible is not, the dreams in the Bible are a whole other conversation and how they relate to modern dream interpretation, or even, let's say, other ancient dream technologies. I think that certainly dreams here in the Bible are always direct communication on some level of something in the quote-unquote empirical world, and not always a reflection of the inner world, but that's also not the case in later dream interpretation in the Talmud and so on. But certainly in this case, I love that you're adding this last piece, Beth. And I'll just say also, and add my 2 cents and say that in some sense, Joseph's life is the interpretation of these dreams. Like in some sense, Joseph knows what to do in this regard, maybe, from God, because he's not really like Amy said, an agrarian or a farmer, or maybe because of what Beth said, he inserted himself into the dream, but maybe also because his own life is the same trajectory of plenty that is followed by many years of famine. And Joseph is telling us not only something about what Pharaoh should do, but what he did in his own survival mechanisms, that he stored in his own heart the 17 years of plenty that he had that would help him survive the next, many years of famine when he was living in hardship and living in exile and in amnesia, that he didn't forget, right? That he tried. And in fact, one of the things that he did was he tried to name, once he is elevated to the viceroy of Egypt, the first thing he does after getting married to that whole weird thing, he gets married and gets a new name, is that he has a child and he names the child Menashe, which means because God helped me forget all of my suffering. But clearly, naming your child the one who helped me forget is a surefire way to never forget that you suffered, but also to never forget, because he uses Hebrew, right? He doesn't name him like he becomes Egyptian, and his wife is Egyptian, but he names his kids Jewish names. Like, he clearly is invested in not forgetting that he was a Hebrew. Like, even though he now had become an assimilated Jew, he decided to name his kid Avramullah, or Merrill, or Shmerel, or Zalman. It's like his name, he's like, I went from being like, he's like, Tony Curtis. He went from being like Moshe Popik to like Tony Curtis, but then he named his kid Avramullah. So that I'll hopefully forget that I was Jewish by naming my kid Avramullah. It's like, what? So there's something profound about his own capacity to store the plenty of his own heritage and hold it in this radical embrace of tension between the beck and call of, finally I'm in Egypt and they see who I really am, but when I was in my family home they didn't see who I am. And he never gave up. He never gave up the hope, I think, that one day he would be who he was, but with his brothers. And that even makes it that much more powerful that he was able to see them. And then by this time, I want to, every year we can decide which Joseph we want to lift up that year. And we don't have to be consistent. That's like, consistency is the hobgoblin, right, of small minds. I want to lift up Joseph's radical spiritual and emotional and intellectual maturity, in that he was able, even at that moment when his brothers were bowing down before him, to not at that moment say to them, oh, see whose dreams came true? Yeah, let's see whose dreams came true. But rather, that would have been for himself, but what he was really interested in was seeing if his brothers had also changed, had they also been humbled. And that's exactly where we're going to pick up the story at 11:45. Join us for that moment. 11:45. Thank you to Gil in Israel. Thank you to all of those here for the open book. Have a good Shabbos, everybody. Good Shabbos.